I think, yeah, the first topic on this is general thoughts on creating classifications based on user expectations. I think we're just going to get thoughts on that.
Well,
Sure.
that's a pretty big question.
I mean, I'd need to dig into the nitty gritty of what does that entail? What does that mean? So that as I'm looking through it from the transportation side, are all those segments going to meet the needs on the transportation end? I mean, I think most of them will. I know that most of our issues for bikes anyway are on the lake loops, and some of the user conflicts on the lake loops is what I hear about. And that's to be expected. A lot of them are older trails. A lot of them are undersized, and they're heavily used. Lots of dog walkers. Again, I always tell the bicyclists, don't expect to go fast if you're going around the lake.
Yeah, especially Shelley Lake on nice days.
Well, Lake Johnson's just as bad.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, so I have a question. So I might live in a certain area and I use that particular trail for recreation, but it might be designated as more of a transportation corridor. So how do you sort of set the expectation that both the recreational user and the person that's using it, for commuting can coexist?
I think it depends on the usage. I mean, if there's some empty section of Walnut Creek Greenway that doesn't see a lot of use, we probably don't have to do anything. But if it's a segment that sees a lot of users of both types, then some striping on the pavement, at least putting down just some kind of shared use marking. I know that I'm working on the on-street side to try and promote that. I mean, even just from a branding perspective, I know so many people that think you're not supposed to ride on the sidewalk. And a lot of our on-street trails are going to look like a wide sidewalk. And how do we sort of message to them that, hey, bikes are appropriate here? I'm thinking of the little tiny piece we've got on South Saunders. Eventually we're going to build that out. And what are some things we can do? I've got some great examples from Europe. I'm still looking for some North American examples. Tom, if you got anything, I'll gladly take whatever you can send my way. What I have seen in North America is, again, just putting those markings down and putting a center line is pretty simple. If it's really heavily used by bicycles, we might even think about two-way striping for bikes and then a separate ped lane. At least on the on-road side, that's what we look at. I don't know that there's a lot of places where we have that much conflict with bikes. I think it's more just how do you educate the bicyclist to slow the heck down if it's really busy?
Yeah, some of that might be starting with a baseline width for all three, or however many classifications we end up with that allow for a certain use and conflict. I think whether it's multiple people passing, somebody else coming on oncoming, I think there's certain widths that you'd start as a baseline as opposed to specifically designing a local trail at, say, 8 feet.
Yeah, and I think the other would be posting a speed limit for bikes. I mean, I know we have one system-wide, but I think putting those sign reminders up at places where we know there's conflicts can sort of help drive the point home. But again, do we need that in some of the sort of empty sections where the use is mostly going to be long distance runners and bikers? It'll be on the weekend. I'm thinking there's some sections of Walnut Creek and some sections of the Neuse River Trail down in the southeast that kind of have that feel.
I'm sorry, Tom. Can you reiterate the guiding question for this breakout session, please? I kind of lost that.
Yeah, so this is discussing the sort of the three classifications as destination trails, scenic trails and loops, and local trails, just as a concept of the three. And then I think the first one was, what are your general thoughts on creating these classifications based on user expectations? So that is sort of the driving factor for the three that we're sort of discussing today. Not that these are settled.
Yeah, I think the only other driving thing I can think of when you're doing the criteria is what's the length. So I'm thinking, what's that one up in the north off of Strickland that just pretty much serves a neighborhood and a school? For the,
I can't remember the name.
yeah, but it's not that long, but you know, that's going to have a whole different set of needs compared to something that's got a fair amount of length, like the Neuse River Trail, or even some of the less used ones like Reedy Creek. When you've got those long contiguous trail sections, you are going to see more bicyclists. So when you do have pedestrians, you're going to have the greater propensity for conflict. I know as I'm looking at reevaluating some of the side paths and trying to come up with a way to find a budget to rehab some of them, length is again one of the key factors I'm looking at as one of the first criteria. So for me, again, just because I know that side of things, like Falls and Neuse and Western and Avent Ferry sort of rise to the top of the list for us just because they're so long. As opposed to, we've got a little tiny piece on Glenwood. Did anybody know we even had a side path on Glenwood? It's a glorified sidewalk. I'm going to just put it out there. But it goes from that insurance building down there by Creedmoor Road, Edwards Mill intersection, up to just to the bottom of the hill and partway up the hill. It's on the north side of Glenwood. Really important. It would be great, but it's not that long. So how much do we put into it? So I don't know if length is a factor in how you're going to classify these, but I know that matters again from the transportation side. And I'll shut up because I've run my mouth for a long time.
Back to the length comment, you know, you might have just a section of trail that's complete now, but over time you'll have a longer length.
Yeah.
And then you may at that point just need to reevaluate, you know, what type of facility that is. But it would be nice, you need to kind of know that ahead of time and plan for it. So you can't just take one piece of, I don't know, you can't take one piece of a corridor and apply one design guideline for it. You have to consider what the entire build out will be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, well, in addition to the user preference, I think, I don't think length should be, at least not the primary determination factor. Maybe it's one of the factors, but not the primary. I would think the destination or the connection of the trails that are linking, maybe there's some different types of destinations along the trail. For example, if we do have, I'm just using roadways now. If we have a major trail along Six Forks, we have another major trail along, say, Letmine, and then there's a connecting piece, and that length is not there, but because it's connecting two major corridors, maybe that piece needs to be more major. However, if you're just connecting the neighborhood, maybe that, even though it might be longer than the distance between Six Forks and Letmine, but it's still serving a neighborhood, especially if they loop the do's around the neighborhood, and that's just depends on how it like what it connects. If it does not connect to Crabtree Valley Mall, it connects to, say, Brookhaven. Maybe it's more of a medium classification, rather than something connects from Crabtree Mall to, I don't know, North Hills.
This is David. So it almost sounds like expanding our trail counter system will be a real contributor to helping us make those determinations, because I think the number of users on a trail will somewhat dictate whether it's a connector or, I'm sorry, if it's a local or if it's a destination.
I'm
No?
sorry,
You're
David.
cringing, Shasheen?
Yeah, I'm a little bit, just because, well, I don't consider myself as a trail counter, but I do go to these smaller trails like Lakeland and Shelley Lake and Lake Johnson. They're loop trails, but they are always more popular than the corridor trails that I've been on. Maybe it's just the timing of the day. If you're just going by trail counters, you would think that those loop trails are more important or maybe wider, maybe you consider those corridor than the actual corridors. The actual corridors, I've been on them too, but they're nowhere near, it may be News River, but the crosstown ones, and they're not as busy as, say, Shelley Lake.
Right, but if you exclude the loop trails, which are under their own classification, and you look at all of the other trails on their own, then
Maybe.
it does the traffic, the counts do impact. It's just one of the options for classification, but because I agree, I don't think length is necessarily a determining factor of what the classification should be. I'd almost be curious, Tom, if when you're looking at the national record examples, if length was a variable in how that was applied.
Yeah, I would have to check back to see if there are any that do factor that in.
So there are. And in fact, they sort of show that as you get more trail length, it grows in terms of its gravity. And so, if you will, its market reach goes a little deeper because it's a bigger facility. And it actually creates a little extra gravity. I know that I can speak to the American Tobacco Trail is a similar deal to the Neuse River Trail. Once you start getting those really long contiguous sections without a lot of crossings, or at least very quiet crossings, you start seeing the usership grow. One worry I would have on the loop trails is just to make sure that we don't preclude them being part of a network. And I'm thinking about, Walnut Creek takes advantage of the North Shore, Lake Johnson. Someday we might get that missing piece of hair snipe to connect down to the rest of the system, down to Crabtree. And then, one side or the other of Lake Lynn will become part of the system. And at least when I use it, the east side of Shelley Lake is part of that sort of, House to Mine Fork to East Mine Fork to Honeycutt complex that ends up being a pretty long run. And I don't know if we'd want to, is the whole thing a loop, or is one side of it get a slightly different treatment from the rest of it?
I'm sorry, guys. My boss's boss is calling. I need to jump off. Really sorry.
Boss's boss.
Yeah, your boss's boss too. And I'll see you later. Hopefully I'll join later. Sorry. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I do think the local trails always have a potential to become the destination trails with just more length too. So I think that's something also to factor in what that would be.
Yeah, I think that's what Lisa was getting at with the plan pieces.
Yep.
It's almost like you can give some guidelines for what establishes one as a commuter trail, one as like neighborhood trail. I forget the words that you guys use, the themes that you use, but I think that you almost have to look at it too on a case-by-case basis to see if you could even, like for lighting, for example, you give some guidelines for where you strategically light those, but when you actually get in for, it's just like any project, once you start getting into the weeds with design, there's so many other factors that have to be looked at to see if you could actually light a corridor, for example. So I think we have to have that, we have to at least have that caveat that, I guess there is an expectation, but it's not always going to have every type of amenity within that corridor. I do think lighting is going to be challenged, and I think that's one thing we're going to have to be really careful about on, the guidelines that we set for where lighting can occur. Because it's not realistic that you're going to light, the entire Crabtree Creek Trail, from begin to end.
Yeah. And
you can have typologies within, like subtypes within each of these. I think that would prioritize where you would have a lit corridor. that may be more
Yeah.
for the utility and commuter trips, and
Right.
where, where it's sensitive to the residential areas as well. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep, or safety.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking specifically of that hill over on Crabtree between Wake Med and Wake Forest Road, where we had the fatality, I think, earlier this year or late last year. Again, just it can be kind of dark. It's hard to discern the trail moving at speed. Center line stripe and a little bit of light might not be a bad idea for places like that. And we don't have that many, but there's a few. But it would be more about that safety aspect.
Wow, we're so energetic.
I think, yeah, the next one
Do I need to do a coffee run for everybody?
probably
Virtual coffee.
the next one is
Espressos.
I already had espresso. I need another one.
I had one before the meeting,
I should have.
but I feel like I can't shut up, so please.
You don't need one. Breakout number 2. Yeah, so the next one is, I guess, getting into the specific expectations for users for trail width, material, amenities, maintenance, all those sorts of details between the 3. So destination, scenic, and local.
Oh, one thing we haven't really talked about is this desire for unimproved trails. I don't want to call them mulch trails. I don't want to call them dirt trails, but just unpaved trails.
Yeah, single track or unpaved.
Yeah, making sure we're capturing or including that into the program. One thing that I've heard that there's a big desire for there to be more of those. And particularly those might fall into corridors that, paving or access or, space is limited.
Is there a portion of the public that's driving that? I'm just curious.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a small percentage.
Yeah, I'm just.
It's a little bit larger than the community that wants whitewater rafting, but it's there.
I mean, from a user perspective, I'm not super on board with it because I'm usually on a bike. But from a stormwater perspective, I think it's a great idea. So I'm kind of torn on that.
But also
Wait,
for
so what
avoidance-
perspective aren't you crazy about it?
From a user perspective, just because I'm usually on a bike when I'm on like the Greenway Trail.
Right. So I guess that would be those types of trails would fall into areas that, have maybe certain pervious surface, restrictions or areas that are just limited in space.
Well, they could also be an initial step in a future Greenway corridor.
I know Wake Forest, so they started taking a lot of their corridors that didn't have funding yet to build a paved trail, and actually using that space for unimproved trails. So that kind of set the framework, or maybe even location of, if one day they would pave them, where the pavement would go. We have a lot of, utility easements that overlay Greenway easements, or other scenarios where it's just, land that's not really accessible. So I don't know. That's something that we've talked about as part of this process, but definitely should be evaluating that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think some communities have had a lot of success too with running a parallel single track or something that's unpaved next to it, whether that came in first or after. But for you see a lot of people on mountain bikes that like to hop off quick and get back on. And so even if it's in short bursts, I think there's been some, especially that more of the destination areas like Boulder, Denver, Northwest Arkansas has had a lot of success with that, with a parallel type system too, where the width is available.
So what was the original question, Tom?
Well, getting into, yeah, we only have 5 minutes or less
Yeah.
now. So getting into, I guess, trail width, material, amenities, maintenance for each of the proposed classifications, I guess, in terms of expectations on each of those. So say
Well,
destination trails, what do we think for a few of those things?
I think the wider the better. I mean, I think as wide as like 14 feet is desired, but I don't know from a stormwater perspective, you know, from some of the environmental permitting that we have to do. So once you start getting a wider trail, you have to get wider easements. And so if we're talking about what wider facilities, then we need to be having the conversation of width of dedication widths, you know, and so that kind of has this domino effect on UDO, stormwater, permitting.
Well,
It's not, you know, go ahead, Ben.
sorry, and just to pick on Shasheen because she's not here, but I think something that parks ought to look at is something that roadway design has done is they've taken projects where they have space to do stormwater treatment and kind of banked credit to pay for the sidewalk projects, basically. So you could almost bank credits on larger park sites for your greenway trails because it's not practical to have stormwater devices and greenway trails in the same area. I mean, it's just, you're not talking about even capturing a good amount of stormwater. So I think that might be something that parks can look at and using their larger sites to kind of build larger devices and get extra credit, for lack of a better term, and apply that nutrient credit to your greenway trails.
Good idea.
And from a user standpoint, the wider the better.
Yeah. So yeah, the wider the better. I mean, with Crabtree West, we're doing 12 feet wide, right? And that's going to be the first project. That'll be the first project that we have in the system that's built really for a commuting user. Can everybody still hear me?
Yeah. I just see time dwindling. I think some of the regional ones we might want to think about trailhead parking and bathrooms too.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, the bathroom and the fire, the water fountains. That's difficult in some of these areas that we actually have trail facilities. So again, get back to my point, and you have to evaluate that from a project perspective.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all nice things to have, but I think this like further analysis needs to be done to see if you can actually.
All right.
That was fun.
I hit pause on my recording. I did everything I was supposed to do, I think.
All right. So far, so good. Good to see everybody again. Hopefully you enjoyed talking with a few people face to face or computer screen to computer screen. Hey, Nick, good to see you. So we are going to jump
Oh my
in.